Every leader knows that a thriving organization depends on the energy, productivity, and commitment of its people. But few leaders are able to cultivate the employee engagement and performance needed for this level of success. What's the difference? Positive leadership practices. Welcome to the Positive Leadership Movement Podcast with your host, positive work culture expert, Alex Bratty. Ready to harness the power of positive leadership? Let's dive right in.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Positive Leadership Movement Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Bratty, and I'm really looking forward to this week's episode because we're going to talk about a very important aspect of leadership that often gets neglected or kind of relegated just over to the HR department. And that topic is onboarding. Our guest knows a thing or two about how to onboard employees in a way that makes them feel comfortable and sets them up for success in an organization. Her name is Allison de Meulder, and she is a pioneer in the online invitation industry. Allison built a $6 million e-commerce company called Invitation Consultants. She started this company at 23 years old. Wow. And 14 years in, she spun off Metric and Eve, a wholesale greeting card company sold in stores such as Paper Source, Sur La Table, and a host of independent boutiques and bookstores. She built her companies on creative leadership, commitment to product, and collaboration. She's also won various design and business awards, and she now runs a podcast all about entrepreneurship called Emerson Built That. So we are very excited to have her on the show today. Allison, welcome.
Thank you so much, Alex, for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I just love your story. I mean, you know, who doesn't want to build a $6 million e-commerce company at the ripe old age of 23? So I know that you have learned a lot in your time as an entrepreneur. And so we're thrilled to talk to you today and hear about that, and especially this onboarding process too. So just to get us started, because I do ask all my guests this, because we love to know, each person's kind of outlook and their definition of positive leadership. So for you, Allison, how do you personally define positive leadership? What does it mean to you?
I love that you talk about positive leadership. It's just a great term, and it's also a great philosophy. So I define it as really empowering the people who work for you to be leaders as well, because I think it's really positive if everyone buys into the leadership in a company. And I think that there are people who think of themselves as leaders and non-leaders, but I truly believe that there's a leader in everyone. So in order to have that positive environment, it's about leaders being the best leaders they can, and then bringing out leadership qualities that people sort of have hidden. Because once people realize their leadership capabilities, then I believe it's a lot about collaboration and creativity to continue leading for whatever they need to, whatever their mission is in the company.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you're emphasizing this notion that there's leadership in everyone. And how true, because, okay, even if you don't have sort of a quote unquote traditional leadership title or position, everyone still can be a leader in some way or another in their position and whatever they're doing. So I love that you're highlighting that and reminding us that no matter where you're at, you do have an opportunity to lead, and you do have an opportunity to influence people around you. So I love that definition. And I love how inclusive it is too, that, hey, we need to bring people along. We need to empower people to be able to lead as well. Love it. So let's talk about onboarding, because you've highlighted this as a really crucial aspect of, the leadership development process, and of course, organizational development in general too. And, I loved it when you brought up this topic, because I really do think, as I said in the intro, I think it gets neglected. I think it's sort of like this afterthought. I think also sometimes CEOs are kind of like, yeah, that's the HR department. They take care of that. And I really don't believe that at all. So I'm really curious to hear, your thoughts on this and sort of why you think onboarding process at a company is so important.
I agree with you. We didn't have an HR department. I was kind of like the HR department as the owner of the business. So I didn't pass it off to anyone. And actually, I loved it. It was one of my favorite parts about the company because it's all about first impressions, and that's what onboarding is. It's the first impression that the new employee is going to give beyond just their, kind of canned answers from their interview, but then also your first impression as a business owner or who. And it's important because it can be a very small thing, or I had a very specific process for our onboarding, but it can really make people feel comfortable. And I think that's what it's about. It's not just about saying what your benefits are or, where your parking spot is. It goes way beyond that. It's about introducing them and sort of like inducting them into the company.
Right. Right. And I'm so glad you said that it's way more beyond like, here's where you park, here's the reception desk, there are the bathrooms, which I think some people think like that's the onboarding process. I mean, yes, it's part of it, of course, right? People have to feel comfortable in their physical surroundings and understand where things are at, or who to go to for certain things. But as you said, it's so much more than that. So tell us a little bit, because you said you had a specific process. I mean, what should an onboarding process look like? And I mean, how does it involve leadership at different levels or areas of the business?
Definitely. So we were a smaller company. So we were at our biggest point, we were 30 people large, but I feel like the process we use could be in even smaller companies or even larger companies. So when we had someone come in, the process was that they would meet with me for half an hour, and we had already met during the hiring process, but I wanted to get to know them a little bit more now that we were out of that, interview process, because that's very different. So they come on in, and then we sort of give them this whole sheet and outline what their first week is going to be like. And their first week, they're actually not doing any work, but the work I think is just more internal in the sense that they were going to every single department that we had. And so they would be handed off from manager to manager of each department, and they would sit with the manager, let's say, of customer service, and then they would talk about the department, and then they would be handed off to someone who actually worked in customer service day to day, and they would listen in on phone calls, and then they would move over to the design department, or they would go to our production department and actually watch orders being printed and packaged. And it was kind of exhausting for them because it was a lot of information to process. But what was happening along the way is they were understanding about the company. They were understanding about our products and our mission, and also seeing the relationships that we had internally. But I truly believe, like when you're talking about leadership, I truly believe that it was, what they could do as far as resources. So they could say, you know what, I'm working in the design area, but now I know someone in customer service and we kind of hit it off. So maybe I want to have lunch with them, or maybe they'll be able to help me with a certain project. So you're starting to build like your network within the company. And I also always think it's important, no matter where you work, you should always know your boss's boss. And it's always important to know like one level up, just because it creates opportunities for you to grow. And I think sometimes people are intimidated by that. It's a little bit easier in a smaller company.
Yeah, absolutely. But even, I mean, regardless of whether the company is small or large, I mean, I think you laid out a few things there. And one of the most striking one for me, because I was thinking about a completely opposite situation that I had once, but this idea that they don't do work per se in that first week. Instead, they're going from different department to department. And yes, they're getting to see how everything works. They're getting to meet people. They're also getting to really understand your culture and see like, okay, this is what it means to work here. Like, because if you go from department to department, you're going to start to see a thread of, the attitude, the way people talk to each other, the way they engage with one another, how they feel about the company. I mean, you can't hide any of that if you have people moving around your whole company in that way. And so I think that really, it provides an environment for people to almost become part of the culture or embrace the culture faster because they're getting exposed to all these different departments and all the things they do. But that whole people part of it and how they interact with one another as they're going through that process.
I absolutely agree with you because culture is so important because people want to feel like they can fit in and that they're happy where they are. And what's interesting is even though they're looking at things from a very cross-functional standpoint when they're going from department to department, like you said, there's a common thread, even though they're doing different jobs or different business areas in the company, there are things that link together that make it feel like a common mission.
Exactly.
And the brand, of course.
Yeah, exactly. And when you really understand that, like, oh, okay, we're all working towards this. And I see how customer service feeds into our transcendental goal, right? Like our overall mission. I see how production feeds into that. I see how marketing feeds into that. Yeah, I think it's so important. And I'll never forget, I mean, I worked at a company going back many years now. But their onboarding process was the absolute antithesis of what you're describing. Literally, work began within 15 minutes of arriving. And the onboarding was what I just said, like, here's the bathroom, here's this, there's your boss's office, this is your desk, that's where you'll sit. And you're going to be working, you're going to shadow, but work with this person this week. And like, that's it. And you started working. And it wasn't until like 6 months in that I was exposed to other departments. And boy, I wish it had happened sooner because to your point, I mean, I knew what that department did in theory. I mean, yeah, like I understand that, but to really see their work and how they do it, and also how that affects what you do, it would have been so much better if that organization had us do what you're describing, which is see it up front first and get a much sort of like get the bird's eye view picture of what's going on in the whole organization, and then begin your work in this one particular area and understand how all these pieces feed into it. Much better way to do things, Allison, for sure.
Yes.
For sure.
Absolutely. What you're describing is very traditional.
Yes, exactly. Right. I mean, it is kind of the traditional approach to the whole thing. And there's not a lot of thought put into it, which is why I'm so glad that you're sharing this and sharing, what you did and how you've seen it work. So tell us a little bit more. I mean, so you had that onboarding process you just described, which I think is phenomenal. And how then, I mean, tell us how that affected things. Like, how did that process set up an employee for success in their role and in your organization? Like, what do you think sort of all the benefits were that came from doing it the way you described?
There were, I would say, two main benefits. One was for the company, one was for the employee. So the first one for the company being that I sort of have this philosophy, and I can't remember what it was from business school, but it was if someone wanted to own a franchise of a fast food company, they would have to go in and flip burgers, right? There's just like this story about that. And that was very much for me, is I was able to do anything. And I think that's what business owners are, is if you need someone to sweep the floor, I'm there. You need someone to, do a budget, I'm there. And what my intention was also with the onboarding is that people would be able to do the process, but then while they were talking, the managers of the areas where they weren't going to be participating in were kind of listening to see what their interest was. And then they would kind of feed me back the information and say, you know what, they work in the design department, but they're kind of interested in working with customers too. And they have in their past, did you know that? And then when we had someone out in our customer service department, they could fill in. So I really believe in the cross-functional training. And we did that a lot because when we had staff members out on maternity or paternity, maternity, and they were able to fill in for them.
Yeah.
And I think that was really important for our organization. And then also they bring things to different areas. Now, from the staff point of view, what was interesting is that by them getting to see different areas of the company, they could decide how they wanted to grow. And we really did encourage people not only growing upwards, and I don't want to say doing lateral moves, but almost like on an angular move, or I'm not really sure what to call that, but where they might go from customer service to design or finance to IT. And just instead of having them leave to explore other opportunities, they were able to stay in the company. We could keep the talent and they would just have another job in the company.
Yeah. And that again, I mean, I think that is such a rare thing that is done, where you give people the opportunity to like, hey, go work in that department if you want to for a while. Go check it out, explore.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, if you create that environment, then guess what? You hold on to people. And, we all know that your business is as good as the people that you have, right? I mean, it's all about people. And so if you've got good talent, man, hold on to them. Let them explore. Let them try out these different things. And certainly from their perspective, it benefits them. But to your point as well, hey, it's also really helpful if people are going to be gone, they're out for a long time for whatever reason. We actually then create cross functionality in our staff as well. So it's one of those classic win-win situations if we can just like pull out of the, I think sometimes as business owners, we get so kind of blinkered in our focus that, okay, the company has to run the way it's going to run. These people are in this department. These people are in this department. These people are in this department. Somebody pops out in one department. It's like, oh, what are we going to do with this space? Like, it's almost like all these things are silos, even though every day we're all interacting. But when it comes to sort of staffing these departments, it becomes more siloed and there isn't a lot of, cross department interaction in that sense. So I love what you're describing. And actually, in a way, I mean, there's more opportunity for that in a larger company. And yet you were doing it as a smaller company, which I think is really amazing.
It definitely breaks down the barriers and it makes the organization more transparent. And I think when that happens, I think it's important to hire people who have a can-do attitude, but I think you can also build that up in people. And we had this one major project. We were on Good Morning America and we offered this deal and we had to send out thousands of mugs within a period of time. And we had to glue a lot of things and put things together. And I was having our CPA on staff. He was there and he was putting together stuff and we had our programmers doing it and they were actually having fun. I mean, we brought in pizza, we're playing music, and I could just imagine some people being like, no way, I'm too good to do that. But it's
Right.
like people wanted to be in that room in that time having fun rather than saying, no, I don't want to do that.
Yeah. Well, and that speaks volumes, I would say, to your leadership and your culture, because clearly you created that kind of culture of, hey, all hands on deck when needed, and we're going to have fun with this, right? I mean, we haven't talked about this a lot, but I get the sense that you injected fun into what you were doing in your company.
I think you have to. I don't think so. We were obviously a startup, and startups are notorious for having pool tables and cupcake bars and all of these great things. Um, but you know what? You can have a startup mentality or this kind of fun mentality even in traditional companies. And I think it's really important because I think that's what the workforce really wants now is I think that business owners and leaders should really realize that people don't want to feel like they're being chained to their desk. They shouldn't want their people to feel like they don't want to come to work every day. They should want to make them feel like Monday is a great day instead of a day where like, oh no, I'm dreading it. And that takes a lot of work and that's really ingrained in the culture, but also by having a great product too. Like you can have a really boring product, but if your culture is great and you're innovative with your product, I think there's a lot there to build upon.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it sounds so obvious and simple when you say it, right? That like we should create an atmosphere where people want to come to work on Monday
Mhm.
and they actually enjoy work, right? And yet most of the world is not like that. I mean, it's always this is why I do this positive leadership movement, right? Because it feels like it is a movement that's got to get out there into the mainstream because it's still kind of the minority of businesses that are actually following that kind of approach, right? And yet it's so obvious. I mean, if your employees are happy, they're going to stick around, they're going to work better, they're going to be better performers. What's not to love about that?
Of
So
course, of
so
course.
tell me this. So, like, this is a question that when I was a partner in a firm a few years ago, we always had this sort of ongoing discussion about how long do you give someone to really find their feet, right? So, how long should an onboarding process be? And is there a point where you say, well, we have onboarded as best we can, we've done everything to support this person, and yet they're not where they need to be? Like, what have you had any experience with that, or do you have any specific advice for that? Like, how long should onboarding be? Is there a point where you cut it off? Is there a point where you sort of have to rethink this employee? Like, tell us your thoughts on that.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question. It's really hard when you realize that someone that you hired is not the right fit, because we were pretty extensive in our interviewing. And I think it's also really sad when they realize that you've realized that, or they might realize that you're not the fit for them.
Mhm.
That happened, I'd say, probably half a dozen times. And so we would have a schedule of, so we would have our onboarding process of obviously the cross-functional meets, but then we would also have a training that would go into it. So depending on department, it could last anywhere between 3 weeks to 2 months.
Mhm.
And we did have people where like, this is just not going to work. They weren't kind of catching on. And so I have this philosophy that I actually got from someone else, and it's hire slow, fire fast. And I think that process really helps, because if you take the time in the hiring, um, you're going to have a better outcome as far as being able to get the right employees. They're going to onboard great and it's going to work out. But if it doesn't work out, then you sort of need to cut your losses. Like, as managers and business owners, I think you know when something's not working. And I think you have to have those times set up front for, depending on the position. Like, we know that this position, let's say graphic designer, is going to onboard in 6 to 8 weeks. If by 8 weeks we're not getting there, or it's a huge struggle, then probably we have to kind of cut our losses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there has to be, and I love actually that saying hire slow and fire fast, because here again, I think the exact opposite is what happens in most companies. Certainly, I have seen it in many organizations that I've worked with, where it's like, we got to fill the spot, people. I mean, to the point where sometimes it's like, here's a warm body, hire this person. I mean, it's just crazy. And then everybody's surprised when it doesn't work out. But they keep trying to make it work because they're like, yeah, but we don't want the person to leave and then the space is empty again. But frankly, it's more painful for everybody, including that employee, to keep them there while you try to find a replacement. It's like, you just got to cut that thing off, because if it's painful for you as the employer, you can be sure it's painful for the employee. It's a two-way street, right? Like, it just, because if you think they're not a fit for you, then they usually think that you're not a fit for them.
Exactly. I think it's definitely obvious to them. And also, if they feel like they're underperforming or not meeting expectations, it chisels away at their self-esteem. And what I found in hiring through the years is, actually there are many people who really need a lot of work on their self-esteem. It's actually not a given for an employee to come in very confident all the
Mhm.
time. And I think as leaders, we need to build them up. And that comes a lot with praising and team builders and making them feel part of the culture.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Right. I mean, look, it's sort of, building that self-esteem and also the self-efficacy, right? I mean, you get hired for a job and then you get in there and you're like, oh my goodness, I don't even know what I don't know. Why did these people hire me? And of course, you had a reason to do it because you saw that that person could be trained, or you knew that they had some knowledge in that area and you could bring them along. But when you're sitting there in that seat, it can be really scary. And so, yeah, I mean, encouraging people, certainly letting them know when they've done a good job. And I mean, look, that's how confidence builds, right? It's like we do something, we do it well, and so we're like, oh, I can do this. Okay, so now I can do something else, right? I mean, and encouraging that along the way. Absolutely. Now, something else you mentioned earlier, which I'm really curious about, is you mentioned this earlier, that you like, especially in the onboarding process, for people to get to know their boss's boss, and
Mhm.
also to get to know leaders in different areas. So we talked about the cross, department, and obviously they're interacting with, peers there and whatnot. But I think you're also talking about, like, hey, they need to interact with the people leading those departments. They need to interact, as you said, with the person even above them, above their direct supervisor. So talk to us a little bit about that and what you see as the advantage of doing that.
So you broke out a little bit, but I think what you were asking me is why someone should get to know their boss's boss. Is that correct?
Yes, and leaders in
Okay,
other
because
departments too, right? So they're not just always just, this is the person I report to, and that's it.
yes. Well, I think it's super important in any organization because it's kind of you're in to go up the ladder and also build relationships. Because if you're on a team of 5 people and you get to know your boss's boss and the rest of the 4 don't, then you might be up for the promotion. Or if your boss leaves and your boss's boss knows you, then you might be up to move into that position.
Mhm.
So there's kind of that strategy about moving in the company, but there's also just from like a growing aspect of it is that you want to know more about what they do and more about the company, because at each level you go to, there's different things you're going to learn about a company that maybe your manager is not privy to. So it's going to open your eyes to more things. And I think that it used to be in the past that, oh my goodness, you don't go and talk to your boss's boss. That's going
Mhm.
above their head. But
Yeah.
now I think that it's not frowned upon anymore. And actually in larger corporations, what I've seen is that you can actually ask to meet with your boss's boss maybe once a month and have like a coffee or, a 10 to 15-minute conversation about learning more about what's going on in a higher level in the company. So I think there are a lot of benefits for growth, but I think it's also interesting from the big boss from their side because they're getting to talk to more people than just their managers or the people that report to them. So I'm huge on relationships and businesses, and I don't think that there should be these like stark lines between levels. I think people should be able to communicate and grow at all levels.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, if you're sort of that leader who's got another leader above them, it does take a little bit of putting your ego off to the side to say, yeah, go and talk to my boss, right? Because I mean, I've certainly in the past worked for people who literally don't want you to talk to their boss because they're worried that somehow, you'll show them up, or they, or the boss will like you better. And it's not, it doesn't work like that. It really doesn't. So I think it takes a little bit of, being willing to put that ego off to the side, and have that happen. And you're exactly right. I mean, from sort of that boss's boss perspective, like the higher level, exactly, they get to see more of the talent in the whole organization and can see sort of like, oh, it might be a good idea to, bring Jim along a bit more. Or, as they're talking to people, they also can see, hey, you know what? Even though, Jane is in department X, she talked to me about this idea, and actually it's something that's going on over here. I wonder if we might, have that conversation. Like, seems like she has expertise in something that's being developed over in R&D. There's ways where, again, coming back to one of your original points, in having that cross department functionality and seeing where people's skill sets and their knowledge can actually support one another across those different teams, because so often we get stuck in those silos and sort of pigeonholed. And, you know, a lot of people have a lot of things, a lot of skills and a lot of strengths to bring. So I love that. I really love, you have a lot of counterintuitive ways of looking at this, the onboarding process, how to develop people, you know, how leaders should be interacting as well. And obviously it has contributed to your success because, hey, you have a very successful journey. So what would, I mean, you were a startup. What would you tell to startups, you know, right now, if there's listeners who are at the beginning of this and aspiring to have a journey like you had, building the $6 million business and having the spin-offs and the great distribution and whatever. I mean, what would be like your, I don't know, top 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice to someone in that position right now?
So I would say I can definitely look at things through a different lens right now because I sold my company in 17. And now I actually do work for a company. I would say my pieces of advice are that building relationships is huge. And I talk a lot about that because I've seen so many people burn bridges and just get caught up in anger or different things where they work. And I just think that you don't always have to be like full of sunshine and, you know, and you certainly shouldn't be a wallflower, but I think that you can strategically build relationships in companies. And I think that's important. I think there's a likability factor, and I'm not talking about being like the class clown. I'm talking about just being a likable person. I think it gets you very far in working in your company, working with clients, working with vendors. It worked really well for me. And I would say, because even now in the job that I'm at, I manage 32 people. I think empathy is huge. I think
Amen.
one of the most important qualities for a leader or a manager to have is empathy, because if you don't have that, then you're not going to have the trust of the people that you manage. And also they're going to be less productive, because why would you want to work for someone who doesn't have empathy for you? And sometimes empathy will cost you in the business place. You know, you need to give a couple days off here, you need to do this, or but it's good to be a good person, and I think that it will go a long way in managing people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it comes down to one of my sort of sayings is, you know, do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And yes, it might cost you. I'm doing air quotes for people who are just listening and not watching. It might cost you in the short term because, like you said, you give a couple of days off or whatever. But in the long term, and that's what we've all got to be looking at, it pays back in spades, because that person's going to remember that, you know, when their family member passed away, that you were empathetic, that you did actually pause and hear them and see them and say, of course, please take all the time that you need. Even though in the back of your head, you're like, I don't know how we're going to get that project done now. But that's secondary to people, you know, it's just secondary. And so that person is going to remember that. And to your point, want to keep working for you and doing a good job because you were the one who said, it's okay. I know, don't worry about this crazy project. Family is first. You go do what you need to do, or whatever the situation is, you know? I mean, yeah, I think that's really sage advice. Empathy is so crucial. I love it. I love it. Well, Allison, I mean, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I mean, you have shared really fantastic insight. And like I said, a lot of it counterintuitive, right? I hope that, you know, this episode is probably creating some moments of thought. Like some people are going to have to listen to this one again because you've turned a few things, I think, on their head from what is traditionally done. And I want to thank you for doing that. So, I mean, of course, we just scratched the surface. We can't get to everything. And so I know listeners are going to want to get in touch with you. So how can they do that? You know, share with us how they can reach out, how they can connect with you.
Definitely. So I have a podcast where I talk with entrepreneurs who have started small businesses, and it is called Emerson Built That. So you can listen in on iTunes or Spotify, and also my website, emersonbuiltthat.com. And on Instagram, I am Matrick and Eve, which was my greeting card company.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And I love, by the way, absolutely love the name of your podcast. It's so cool. Emerson Built That. I mean, I get the sense if I tune into that, which I'm going to do now that you're on the show and I'm aware of it, that, it's going to be innovation. It's going to be people talking about sort of cutting edge views and what they're doing in their startups or in their business. And really kind of taking that, novel approach at looking at everything. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that. That's fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome. Well, it's been such a pleasure having Allison on the show. Be sure to check out her podcast, Emerson Built That. And I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us for this episode. If you have positive leadership stories or questions about this week's topic, if you want to get in touch with Allison, just reach out to me. Send me an email at questions@positiveleadershipmovement.com. I always love to hear from you. And if you've emailed me before, you know that I actually return every single one of those emails. It does not go into some random email box that nobody monitors. I do get back to everyone. So drop me a line, let me know your stories or your questions. All right, that's a wrap for this week. This is Alex Bratty signing out and thanking you for being part of the positive leadership movement and inspiring me to do what I do every single day.
Make sure you subscribe to the show. If you like this episode, please rate and review. If you want to get more from Alex, check out Happiness at Work, where she provides leaders with a proven path to cultivate a positive work culture that increases performance, productivity, and profitability. Go to happinessatworknow.com. Join us next week and harness the power of positive leadership for your organization.